It moved. February the 21st, 1804, 6 in the morning. A Welsh valley still dark at the edges. And the locomotive moved. 10 tons of iron stacked on 4 flat wagons. 70 paying passengers crowded onto the load for the spectacle. A cast iron boiler burning coal so hot the air around it shimmered. And the whole assembly lurched forward along 9 miles of tram road that nobody had ever asked to carry this weight before. I've spent 3 years trying to understand what that morning actually was. Not from the patents, not from the letters that survive, from trying to replicate, with my own hands and my own failures, what Richard Trevithick built. What that process taught me about the man changed everything I thought I'd already learned. But let me tell you how he got there. Let me tell you where this started, because Penydarren was not a beginning. Penydarren was the end of a very long argument with everything that came before. Richard Trevithick grew up inside machines. His father was a mine captain in Camborne, Cornwall, a man who spent his working life inside the shafts that fed the copper and tin trade that fed everything else. And the boy followed him underground early enough that the darkness never frightened him the way it frightened other boys. What frightened young Richard was waste, specifically the waste he could see, the Newcomen atmospheric engines that pumped the mine workings, squat brick towers, breathing out steam at each upward stroke of the piston, consuming mountains of coal to do the work of pulling water from the rock. He watched these engines from the time he was old enough to stand at the engine house door. And the thing that burrowed into him, that he couldn't dislodge, was simple. They were working against themselves. The atmospheric engine's principle was this. You fill a cylinder with steam, then you cool the cylinder to condense the steam back to water, and the collapse of the steam creates the vacuum that drives the piston down. James Watt had improved it enormously by moving the condenser outside the cylinder. But both designs shared the same underlying choice: low-pressure steam, working at or just above atmospheric pressure, doing work through collapse rather than expansion. The reason nobody had pushed beyond this was partly physics and mostly fear. A high-pressure boiler that ruptured didn't just fail, it killed everyone near it. The engineering establishment's position was that the risk wasn't worth taking. Matthew Boulton's position, expressed through the patent system he and Watt had weaponized, was that anything that threatened the low-pressure monopoly was dangerous and illegal.
What they call safe is what they call profitable. I call it waste.
I found that line in a letter Trevithick wrote in 1797. He was 26 years old, already building test engines in the workshop at Gilfack Farm that his father-in-law had given him access to. When I tried to reconstruct one of those early test engines, a small, stationary, high-pressure engine, nothing dramatic, just enough to demonstrate the principle, I spent 4 days failing to get the cylinder bore smooth enough for a proper piston seal. Trevithick apparently did it in an afternoon. That's the first thing the physical reconstruction teaches you. The sources compress time in ways that make the work seem easier than it was. And then they compress it again in a way that hides how easy it was for him. The 1800 road carriage was the first time Trevithick put a high-pressure engine in something that moved. A road locomotive built at the Camborne foundry, a machine that climbed a hill at 4 miles per hour on Christmas Eve, watched by a small crowd of miners who understood they were seeing something that shouldn't work. I've tried to trace every modification Trevithick made to that carriage from the surviving records. And what I can say with confidence is this: the records don't tell you everything. There's a gap between what Trevithick wrote down and what Trevithick actually did. And that gap is the shape of tacit knowledge, the knowledge that lives in the hands and not in the patent. The skill you can't describe because describing it would require a different language than the one we have.
He doesn't write the good bits down. The good bits he just does.
Amos Tregoning had worked beside Trevithick since that Camborne carriage. He wasn't an engineer by training. He'd come to the work the way most workshop hands came to it, through proximity and aptitude and the specific intelligence that recognizes a machine worth understanding. By 1803, when Samuel Homfrey's commission arrived from Merthyr Tydfil, Amos knew Trevithick's engines the way a skilled musician knows a particular instrument. Not just what the notes are, but where the tension lives, where the material wants to give way.
Homfrey's offer was this:
build a steam locomotive that can haul 10 tons of iron 9 miles along the Penydarren tram road, from the Ironworks to the canal basin at Abercynon. He had a wager of £500 against Richard Crawshay, his rival ironmaster, who said it was impossible. Homfrey didn't particularly care whether it was possible. He cared whether it could be demonstrated publicly in February. What Trevithick felt receiving this offer, the letters don't say. But I think I know what he felt. I've replicated enough of his work to recognize the moment when a problem clicks into focus, when the abstract becomes specific, when the idea you've been carrying becomes the dimensions of an actual casting. That feeling doesn't leave room for much else. They arrived at Penydarren in late autumn of 1803, and they built the locomotive there, in the Ironworks' own foundry, using Penydarren iron. This is something the written accounts underplay. Trevithick didn't just design a locomotive at Penydarren. He learned it there, in real iron, at the tolerances that real iron could hold. The theoretical design he'd carried in his head for years met the physical reality of the materials, and the machine that emerged from that collision was different from the machine in the papers.
I stood in the workshop the night before the trial, I imagine.
Or rather, I've stood in workshops that felt like it, rebuilding machines by lamplight when the hands know more than the eyes do. Fitting valve seats by feel because the light isn't good enough for the eye to be useful. There was a letter from Anne Trevithick on the workbench that night. I know this because Amos mentioned it years later in a conversation that got recorded third hand. He mentioned it in passing, as though it were unremarkable. He was already noticing the things Trevithick didn't notice about himself. William Richards, the Penydarren furnace foreman, had walked the tram road 3 times in the week before the trial. He was not a man who alarmed easily. 30 years of ironwork teaches you to distinguish genuine danger from the ordinary frightening noise that industry makes. But the section near the Quaker's Yard Bridge was flexing under test loads in a way he didn't like. The cast iron rail there had been laid for horse-drawn trams carrying 2 tons, not for a locomotive carrying 5 times that. He mentioned this to Amos one evening, while Trevithick was still in the foundry at 9 o'clock. Amos looked at him for a moment.
Have you told Richard?
He'd run it anyway.
Richards was right, and Amos knew it, and neither of them told him.
9 miles, 4 hours, 5 minutes.
The morning of February the 21st,
was cold and damp, the way Welsh February mornings are always cold and damp. Not dramatically cold, not the kind of cold that makes a good story, just the persistent gray chill that gets into everything and makes iron feel thicker in the hands. The locomotive stood at the works gate in the pre-dawn dark. Trevithick had been there since 4 in the morning. I've tried to describe what that locomotive looked like, and the honest answer is that the surviving descriptions are inadequate and the reconstruction drawings are contested. What I can say from working with similar machines is this: it was smaller than you'd expect. The boiler was a horizontal cylinder, roughly 4 feet in diameter and 8 feet long, set on a wrought iron frame above 4 wheels of cast iron. The single vertical cylinder was housed in the boiler itself, a design Trevithick used for compactness, accepting the thermal inefficiency in exchange for reduced weight. A single flue ran through the boiler and exited into the chimney stack. The chimney was a critical detail that the sources mention, but don't explain. Trevithick used the exhaust steam, not wasted into the air, but turned back up through the chimney to increase the draft on the fire. It was the blast pipe principle, the precursor of everything that would make locomotives viable at scale. He didn't write it down as a principle. He did it because it worked.
Confirm, Mr. Humphrey.
I will record it as stated. For 9 months, by master, £500 it is. Back to do with Rob.
The safety valve. I spent 2 days getting a replica safety valve to seat correctly on a reconstruction boiler last year. And what I found was that the face angle Trevithick used, ground to a specific taper by hand, creates a seal that releases cleanly at the target pressure and reseats cleanly below it. There's no document describing the exact angle. You find it by doing it wrong, then doing it slightly less wrong, then feeling the moment when the fit is right. The knowledge lives in the file and the hand. Trevithick designed that valve to protect the engine from destroying itself, a mechanism that releases pressure before the vessel fails. He filed every seat by feel until the release was clean. I find it impossible to think about that without also thinking about what he couldn't do for himself. The trial began at 8:30. Humphrey was there with a committee of witnesses. The wager required independent verification, and £500 required attention. Crawshay's representative stood apart from the Penydarren group with the deliberate neutrality of a man who expects to collect. The crowd of ironworkers and their families who had gathered along the first half-mile of tram road were not neutral. They had a different relationship with the machine. It was built from their iron, in their foundry, and it was about to either redeem or embarrass everything they'd been told it could do.
Not today, not today.
She's reading 4 atmospheres. Fire's clean.
Not today.
It moved. Not quickly,
Today.
a walking
Not
pace,
today.
roughly 5 miles per hour, and not smoothly, the flanged wheels finding the rail unevenly on the first 100 yards, where the morning frost had made the iron slick. But it moved, and it kept moving, and the sound it made was unlike anything that had existed in that valley before. A deep, rhythmic exhalation, not the hissing gasp of an atmospheric engine, but something percussive, purposeful, pressurized. People ran alongside it on the first mile. Some of them were laughing. Amos walked beside the locomotive, with one hand near the regulator, not touching it, just
the beginning.
near it.
See something else to the future of Wales.
The second mile was where the load began to tell. 10 tons of pig iron on the wagons, plus the passengers who'd climbed on for the spectacle, plus the locomotive itself. Roughly 20 tons total crossing rail that had been laid for horse-drawn trams. The locomotive didn't struggle. The pressure gauge held. The fire burned clean. But Richards was walking the track 200 yards ahead of the locomotive, and he was watching the rail beneath his boots. And what he saw was the cast iron plates shifting. Not breaking. Not yet. But shifting, the stone sleepers beneath them, pressing down into the marshy valley floor under a load they'd never been asked to carry.
Not today. Not today.
4 hours and 5 minutes. That was the total time for 9 miles with 10 tons of iron. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, not because it was fast, but because it was possible. No horse, no teams, no driver walking the animals through the muddy sections near the river crossing. Just the pressure of water becoming steam, becoming force, becoming motion. When the locomotive reached the Abersonon terminus, Homfrey's people were there to count the iron and verify the load. Crawshay's representative counted it twice. 500 pounds changed hands later that week without ceremony. But the rails hadn't held. On the return run, Trevithick drove it back empty over the same 9 miles to demonstrate repeatability. 3 sections of tram road rail had lifted from their sleepers. The cast iron plates had cracked under the weight. The locomotive hadn't failed. The world under it had. I've thought about that a lot. The invention worked perfectly. The infrastructure it required didn't yet exist. Trevithick had proved, beyond argument, that high-pressure steam could move a train. He'd also revealed, without understanding the full shape of it, that making rail locomotion practical would require a generation of infrastructure work before his machine could become something the world actually used. Homfrey celebrated that evening with the kind of thoroughness that 500 pounds and an embarrassed rival make possible. Trevithick was there for the early part of it, but Amos noticed and mentioned, decades later, that Richard had gone quiet over the course of the meal. Not from exhaustion, not from drink, but from looking back through the evening toward the conversation he'd already moved into. He was already planning the modification that would distribute the locomotive's weight more evenly across the rail, already sketching the next version.
He won 500 pounds for Homfrey that day. I watched him spend maybe 10 minutes being pleased about it.
The wager proved the locomotive. The locomotive proved the principle. The principle was correct in every detail. And Trevithick was already somewhere else entirely, leaning into the future, where the next proof was waiting, where the next demonstration would finally settle the question for good. The question that was already settled, that had been settled 9 miles ago, that nobody, least of all Richard Trevithick, had told him he was allowed to stop proving.
Ambiguous. A later hand confirmed it.
The weeks after Penydarren were productive, in the way that weeks after a major proof are always productive for someone who cannot stop. Trevithick had a second locomotive sketched before the patent on the first had been properly registered. He had modifications, deeper flanges on the wheels to better track the rail, a different exhaust arrangement to reduce back pressure at the valve, a revised weight distribution to address the problem the tramroad had revealed. The patent itself, number 2599, registered in 1804, described the high-pressure locomotive principle in broad enough terms to cover most of what any subsequent engineer would do with steam locomotion. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential patents ever filed in Britain.
Trevithick never made a pound from it.
Not because the patent was wrong, not because the lawyers failed him, though they did eventually, but because a man who is constitutionally incapable of sitting still long enough to build a commercial operation is also constitutionally incapable of sitting still long enough to protect one. Humphrey funded the second Penydarren locomotive, and then a third, and then Trevithick was already designing a London demonstration engine, the Catch Me Who Can, for a circular track in Bloomsbury. And then he was in South America, and then he was bankrupt, and then he was watching George Stephenson win the Rainhill trials with a machine built on every principle Trevithick had proved at Penydarren.
The engine wants another modification. The pressure can be higher. The materials exist now, I've checked them. Another 50 pounds per square inch, and we recalculate the wheel diameter for the additional torque.
Amos heard this. He'd heard versions of it for 4 years. He had a daughter who was 3 years old by this point. A fact I mention not for sentiment, but because Trevithick didn't know her age. He'd met her twice. Once as an infant, once at 18 months, when he'd briefly returned to Cornwall before the London plans took over. He liked her, in the distracted way he liked everything that wasn't the immediate engineering problem. Amos had stopped mentioning her to Richard directly. There didn't seem to be any point.
The Penydarren locomotive,
After the trial runs, was converted to stationary use, driving hammers at the ironworks. This was the practical outcome. The machine that had moved the world stayed in one place for the rest of its working life, doing the kind of steady, bounded work that Trevithick found too slow for his attention. I think about that conversion a lot. The locomotive that proved everything, anchored to a spot, turning a shaft, doing good work, unmoving.
One morning in the third week of the London preparation,
Amos wasn't at the workshop at 7. This was not in itself unusual. Amos handled suppliers, measured materials, managed the workshop accounts that Trevithick consistently forgot to keep. He might have been at the iron merchant. He might have been at the casting house, checking on a cylinder bore.
he wasn't at the iron merchant.
He wasn't at the casting house. He was at home, in Cornwall, where his daughter had learned to say his name in the past 3 weeks, and he hadn't heard it.
Do they know who made them?
He sent a note. It arrived 4 days after he left, which tells you something about the postal routes, and something about how little Trevithick had noticed the silence at the bench beside him. The note said that he wished Richard the best with the London engine, that he'd learned more about how machines work than he'd imagined possible when they started, that he hoped the engine worked the way Richard knew it would. It was a gracious note. Amos was a gracious man. The tools he'd left on their hooks in the workshop stayed there.
Right. Well, I'll need someone who can... The flange casting needs checking before Thursday. Right.
3 days. That's how long it took Trevithick to notice Amos was gone. Not because he was a bad man. I want to be precise about this, because the process of reconstruction has taught me something about the difference between character flaw and character structure. Trevithick wasn't cruel. He wasn't cold. He was simply assembled in such a way that the machine occupied the bandwidth that most people use for noticing the person beside them. The letter from Anne was still on the workbench in Merthyr. I assume no one recorded removing it. Her letters had become less frequent across the months of Penydarren. Not stopped, just less. Like a pressure valve that's releasing more than it used to. Like something inside is trying to tell you that the containment is straining.
Trevithick had designed the safety valve.
He'd filed every seat by feel. He knew, better than almost anyone alive in 1804, what it meant when a vessel under pressure began to release more than it had before. But that knowledge, the embodied knowledge, the knowledge that lived in his hands and his instrument checks, and his careful attention to the gauges, that knowledge apparently didn't transfer to the other vessels in his life. The Catch Me Who Can ran in London for 2 months in 1808. A circular track in Bloomsbury, a shilling to ride, spectators watching the first steam-powered public railway in the world. Then a rail broke. The locomotive derailed. Trevithick lacked funds for the repair. The exhibition closed.
In the workshop off the Euston Road,
the tools Amos had left behind were still on their hooks. Nobody had moved them. The bench beside Trevithick's was exactly as it had been. If you'd come into that workshop, you might have thought the man had just stepped out for a moment. You might have thought he'd be back.
(1829).
The Rainhill Trials, Lancashire. 5 locomotives competing for the right to haul passengers on the new Liverpool and Manchester Railway. The first railway built specifically for steam locomotion. The first to use only steam power. The first to connect 2 cities through nothing but rail and fire. George Stephenson's Rocket won. It did this by combining principles that Richard Trevithick had proved individually at Penydarren 25 years earlier. High-pressure steam, blast pipe exhaust, multi-tube boiler, assembled into a coherent commercial machine by a man who had the organizational capacity and the support structures that Trevithick had never managed to build for himself.
Trevithick was there.
I want to tell you he was there in triumph, but the record doesn't support it. He was 60 years old and recently returned from a decade in South America, where he'd gone to work on mining machinery and where various combinations of political upheaval, ill fortune, and his own inability to protect his financial interests had left him without money or resources. He'd come back to England nearly destitute. He watched Stephenson's rocket, watched it run, watched the crowd react, watched the exact kind of demonstration he'd given at Penydarren, now repeated with commercial infrastructure behind it. And whatever he felt, the letters don't say.
I spent a long time trying to find out
What Trevithick was thinking at Rainhill. Not from the records are almost silent on this, but from trying to understand the shape of what the previous 30 years had been. A man who has proved everything he set out to prove, who has seen every principle vindicated, who watches from the crowd as the world catches up to where his hands were in 1804. Does that feel like satisfaction? Like injustice? Like both at once? In the bittersweet way that only comes when you realize the cost, only after the account is settled. Robert Stephenson, George's son, met Trevithick at Rainhill. He knew the history, knew what Penydarren had been, knew what the patent meant, knew that the machine his father had just demonstrated was built on principles Trevithick had originated. He helped Trevithick secure a small annuity from the Institution of Civil Engineers. It wasn't much. It was something. It acknowledged, in the careful, formal language of professional recognition, that the hands which had filed the first safety valve seat and coaxed the first locomotive along 9 miles of Welsh tram road had not done so in a vacuum, that the work had accumulated, that the work mattered.
I don't begrudge them. The engine is right. That's what matters.
He was right. The engine was right. Every principle Trevithick had proved at Penydarren was correct, was so correct that it ran the world for the next 150 years in basically the form he'd intuited. High-pressure steam in a locomotive boiler, blast pipe exhaust increasing the draft on the fire, flanged wheels on iron rails, a regulator valve governing the admission of steam to the cylinder. He'd discovered all of it. He'd proved all of it. He'd built it with his hands when it still looked impossible, and the establishment was still insisting it was dangerous, and Watt's patent lawyers were still insisting it was illegal. He was right about every single thing. And Amos Tregoning was in Cornwall, still. He'd gone on to build engines for the mining trade. Competent, careful work. The kind of work that gets done steadily and doesn't break anything that can't be repaired. He had grandchildren by 1829. He had a workshop of his own. He had, by every account that touched him, a life of the kind that is measured in the presence of people who are glad you're there. In the workshop above the Euston Road, if anyone still had access to it, there were tools on hooks whose owner's hands they'd remember forever. The physical memory of a man who had loved the work without being consumed by it, who'd understood, or decided, which might be the same thing, that the safety valve principle applied to more than steam. Here is what I've learned from years of reconstruction work. Tacit knowledge is the most honest thing a craftsman leaves behind. Not the patents. Patents describe what the inventor wanted to protect, which is not always what they actually knew. Not the letters. Letters describe what the writer wanted to communicate, shaped by the audience and the moment. The tacit knowledge is what the hands carry. It's in the angle of the file, the pressure of the fit, the feel of a seal seating cleanly. It can't be counterfeited, and it can't be faked. And it persists in the tools, and the materials, and the worn places on the work surface long after the person is gone. Trevithick's tacit knowledge was extraordinary. The physical intelligence he brought to high-pressure steam, the feel for tolerances, for material behavior under load, for the point at which theory becomes metal, was so refined that it bordered on a separate sense. His hands knew things his notes didn't say. The engines he built were better than the engines his documentation would have allowed someone else to build. There was knowledge in him that never made it into any permanent form.
The pressure always wants to go somewhere. You design the valve, or the pressure designs its own way out.
He died in 1833, 4 years after Rainhill. 62 years old, still working, still looking at the next problem. He'd been in Dartford when it happened, collaborating on a new steam engine design with John Hall's engineering firm. The men who worked with him there said he was the same at 62 as he'd been at 26, relentlessly attentive to the machine, incapable of leaving a problem alone, physically gifted in ways that made watching him work feel like watching a musician who has stopped being aware of the mechanics of playing. He left no estate. The fortune that should have followed from 1804's patent never materialized. For all the reasons that fortunes don't follow from genius, when the genius in question cannot be made to sit still long enough to build a business. His family was provided for by subscription from the engineering profession. A further acknowledgement, formal and slightly sad, that the work Trevithick had done was foundational, and the man who'd done it had not been able to protect himself. I keep coming back to the safety valve. Trevithick spent weeks getting that valve seat right on the Penydarren locomotive. He ground it by hand, checked it by feel, adjusted the tension until the release was clean at 4 atmospheres, and the reseat was clean below it. The valve was the machine's protection against its own power, the mechanism that kept the pressure from becoming destruction. He designed it with the same physical intelligence he brought to everything else. He understood it perfectly. He just understood it only for the engine.
File 1, worn to approx half original length. Handle
Was widened and relayed with heavier rail in the 18 teens.
left on hook.
The infrastructure that had failed under the locomotive in 1804 was rebuilt to carry the loads that Trevithick had proved possible. The second and third locomotives he built were used for years, then scrapped for their iron when they wore out. The original, the one that ran 9 miles on February the 21st, was converted to a stationary engine and worked at the Penydarren foundry until it was no longer worth repairing.
She was a good engine. Did the work she was given.
I've looked at the surviving records of the Penydarren trial from every angle I can reach. The technical documents, the witness accounts, the patent filings, the letterbook entries, the industrial archaeology of the tramroad bed, where sections of the original stone sleepers are still visible under the grass of the Taff Vale. And I've tried to build what Trevithick built, at reduced scale, with modern materials. Not because I thought I could replicate the exact machine, but because I believed I could replicate the understanding, the physical knowledge, the thing you only get by doing. What I learned was this: Trevithick was right. Right about high-pressure steam. Right about the blast pipe. Right about the flanged wheel on the iron rail. Right about the pressure tolerances, the valve design, the cylinder placement, the weight distribution. He was right in every technical particular, proved it with his hands in 1804, and the world spent the next 3 decades catching up to where his fingers had already been. He was also right about the safety valve, about the principle that a vessel under pressure requires a mechanism to release. He just never applied it to the man building the machine. He designed the relief for the engine and left himself sealed. The last tool Amos Tregoning left at that London workshop was a file. Worn to about half its original length, the handle bound with cord that Amos had rewound 3 times, the teeth still sharp enough to work. I know this because someone cataloged the workshop contents when the lease ended. They noted it without comment. A file, worn, well-maintained, left behind. The safety valve on the Penydarren locomotive released cleanly at 4 atmospheres for the full 9 miles of the trial run on February the 21st, 1804. Not once did it stick. Not once did the pressure exceed the design limit. Trevithick had filed the seat correctly. The engine knew how to release what it couldn't hold. It ran the full distance, delivered the full load, proved the full principle, and stopped. Not every machine gets that grace. Not every engine knows when to stop. And some of the best work in the world comes from the ones that don't. What Trevithick's hands knew, they knew completely. What they built honestly, with the full force of a mind that could not be divided or diminished or satisfied. The Rainhill Trials, 1829. The rocket running its laps in Lancashire. And somewhere in the crowd, a man who'd been right about all of it since a cold morning in Wales, watching the world finally arrive at where he'd left his handprints on the iron 25 years before. He'd designed the valve correctly. The pressure releases clean. The engine survives itself.
Not everyone does. The engine survives itself. Not everyone does.